39. New Stirrings, the British Reform Movement. It was not only by monarchs and their ministers that the older privileged, feudal, and ecclesiastical interests were threatened. Beginning about 1760, they were challenged also by broader-based political and social groups, growing out of the Enlightenment and out of the failure of governments to cope with grave social and fiscal problems. A new era of revolutionary disturbance was about to open. It was marked above all by the Great French Revolution of 1789, but the American Revolution of 1776 was also of international importance. In Great Britain, too, the long drawn-out movement for parliamentary reform that began in the 1760s was in effect revolutionary in character, though nonviolent, because it questioned the foundations of traditional English government and society. In addition, in the last third of the 18th century, there was revolutionary agitation in Switzerland, in the Austrian Netherlands and Holland, in Ireland, Poland, Hungary, and Italy, and in lesser degree elsewhere. After 1800, revolutionary ferment was increasingly evident in Germany, Spain, and Latin America. This general wave of revolution in Europe and the Atlantic world may be said not to have ended until the revolutions of 1848, or even until the later consolidation of modern national states around 1870. Onset of an age of democratic revolution, 645. For the whole period, the term Atlantic Revolution has sometimes been used because countries on both sides of the Atlantic were affected. It has been called also an age of democratic revolution, 352, because in all the diversity of these upheavals, from the American Revolution to those of the mid-19th century, certain principles of modern democratic societies were affirmed in one way or another. In this view, the particular revolutions, attempted revolutions, or basic reform movements are seen as aspects of one great revolutionary wave by which virtually the whole area of Western civilization was transformed. There is also another view of this revolutionary age, namely that each country presented a special case, which can be misunderstood if specific national events are described only as part of a vague general international turmoil. Thus, the American Revolution, it is argued, was essentially a movement for independence, conservative in its objectives, and entirely different from the French Revolution, in which a thorough renovation of all society and ideas was contemplated, and both were utterly different from what happened in England, where there was no revolution at all. It need only be stressed here, however, that the American revolutionaries, the French Jacobins, the United Irish, the Dutch Patriots, and similar groups, though differing from each other, shared much in common that can only be characterized as revolutionary and as contributing to a revolutionary age in the Atlantic world. Age of democratic revolution. It is important to see in what ways the movement that began about 1760 was and was not democratic. It did not generally demand universal suffrage, though a handful of persons in England made such demands as early as the 1770s, and some of the American states practiced an almost universal male suffrage after 1776, as did the more militant French revolutionaries in 1792. It did not aim at a welfare state, nor question the right of property, though there were signs pointing in these directions in the most extreme wing of the French Revolution. It did not, 6 and 46, generally promote equal rights for women or the abolition of slavery, though some women and early abolitionists strongly asserted that the rights of man should apply equally to women and enslaved people, and slavery was, temporarily, abolished in the French colonies in 1794. It was not especially directed against monarchy as such. The quarrel of the colonial Americans was primarily with the British Parliament, not the king. The French proclaimed a republic by default in 1792, 3 years after their revolution began. The revolutionary Poles after 1788 tried to strengthen their king's position, not weaken it, and revolutionary groups could come into action where no monarchy existed at all, as in the Dutch provinces before the French Revolution, and the Swiss cantons, the Venetian Republic, or again in Holland under French influence after 1795. Indeed, the first revolutionary outbreak of the period occurred in 1768 at Geneva, a very non-monarchical small city republic, ruled by a close-knit circle of hereditary patricians. Royal power, where it existed, became the victim of revolutionaries only where it was used to support various privileged social groups. The revolutionary movement announced itself everywhere as a demand for liberty and equality. It favored declarations of rights and explicit written constitutions. It proclaimed the sovereignty of the people, or nation, and it formulated the idea of national citizenship. In this context, the people were essentially classless. It was a legal term, signifying not government, but the community over which public authority was exercised, and from which government itself was in principle derived. To say that citizens were equal meant originally that there was no difference between noble and commoner, a radical idea in societies that had always made legal distinctions between persons in different social categories. To say that the people were sovereign meant that neither the king, nor the British Parliament, nor any group of nobles, patricians, regents, or other elite possessed power of government in their own right, that all public officers were removable and exercised a delegated authority within limits defined by the Constitution. Nobody, in theory, could act or exercise power above the law. There must be no magistrate above the people, no self-perpetuation in 353 647 office, no rank derived from birth and acknowledged in the law. Social distinctions, as the French said in their Declaration of Rights of 1789, were to be based only on common utility. Elites of talent or function there might be, but none of birth, privilege, or estate. Aristocracy in every form must be shunned. In representative bodies, there could be no special representation for special groups. Representatives should be elected by frequent elections, not indeed by universal suffrage, but by a body of voters, however defined, in which each voter should count for one in a system of equal representation. Representation by numbers with majority rule replaced the older idea of representation of social classes, privileged towns, or other corporate groups. Women, specific racial groups, and enslaved persons, however, were excluded from voting, public offices, and political participation in legislative institutions. Liberty and equality. Everything associated with absolutism, feudalism, or inherited rights, except the rights of property, and the denial of rights because of gender or birth into slavery, was repudiated. Likewise rejected was any connection between religion and citizenship or civil rights. The Democratic Revolution undermined the special position of the Catholic Church in France, the Anglican in England and Ireland, and the Dutch Reformed in the United Provinces. This was also the great period of what has been called Jewish emancipation, which gave Jews political and social rights that had been denied to them throughout the Middle Ages and early modern era. The whole idea that government, or any human authority, was somehow willed by God and protected by religion faded away. A general liberty of opinion on all subjects was countenanced in the belief that it was necessary to progress. Here again, the secularism of the Enlightenment was carried from science and philosophy into many of the new political and cultural institutions that emerged during this era of revolutionary change. 648 on the whole, the Democratic Revolution was a middle-class movement, and indeed the term bourgeois revolution was later invented to describe it, though bourgeois refers to cultural values as well as to a broadly defined social economic class. Many of its leaders in Europe were in fact nobles who were willing to forgo the historic privileges of nobility. And many of its active supporters were of the poorer classes, especially in the Great French Revolution. But the middle classes were the great beneficiaries, and new middle class or bourgeois societies generally emerged from the revolutionary upheavals. Persons of noble ancestry continued to exist after the storm was over, but the social and political world of noble hierarchies was gone. Nobles henceforth either took part in various activities on much the same terms as others, or retreated into exclusive drawing rooms to enjoy their aristocratic distinctions in private. The main drive of the working classes was still to come. The English-speaking countries, Parliament and Reform. If the American Revolution was the first act of a larger social and political drama, it must be understood also in connection with the broader British world of which the American colonies formed a part. The British Empire, in the middle of the century, was decentralized and composite. 31 governments were directly subordinate to Westminster, ranging from the separate Kingdom of Ireland through all the Crown and Charter colonies to the various political establishments maintained in Asia by the East India Company. The whole empire, with about 15,000 people of all colors in 1750, was less populous than France or the Austrian monarchy. The whole tract of the American mainland, from Georgia to Nova Scotia, compared in the number of its European or white population with Ireland or Scotland, or with Brittany or Bohemia, a figure of about 2,000 being roughly applicable in each case. 354. Britain had its own way of passing through the Age of Enlightenment. There was general contentment with the arrangements that followed the English Revolution of 1688. It has often been remarked that nothing is so conservative as a successful revolution. British thought generally lacked 649, the asperity of thought on the continent. The writers who most resembled French philosophers, such as the Scottish philosopher David Hume and the English historian Edward Gibbon, were moderate in their political ideas. The prevailing mood, however, was one of complacency, a self-satisfaction in the glories of the unwritten British Constitution by which Englishmen enjoyed liberties unknown on the continent. The monarchy in Great Britain. In Britain, Parliament was as supreme as the monarchs in most continental countries. The British Parliament was indeed more sovereign than any European ruler, because less that could be called feudalism remained in England than on the continent. Nor was there any political despotism in England, enlightened or otherwise. The young George III, who inherited the throne in 1760, did feel himself to be a patriot king. He did wish to heighten the influence of the crown and to overcome the factionalism of parties. But it was through Parliament that he had to work. He had to descend into the political arena himself, buy up or otherwise control votes in the Commons, grant pensions and favors, and make promises and deals with parliamentary politicians. What he did, in effect, was to create a new faction, the King's Friends. This faction was in power during the ministry of Lord North from 1770 to 1782. It is worth noting that all factions were factions of Whigs, that the Tory party was practically defunct, that Britain did not yet have a two-party system, and that the word Tory, as it came to be used by American revolutionaries, was little more than a term of abuse. While Parliament was supreme and constitutional questions apparently settled, there were nevertheless numerous undercurrents of discontent. These were expressed because the press was freer in England than elsewhere, in many books and pamphlets that were read in the American colonies and helped to form the psychology of the American Revolution. There was, for example, a school of Anglo-Irish Protestant writers who argued that because Ireland was in any case a separate kingdom, with its own parliament, it ought to be less dependent on the 650 central government at Westminster. The possibility of a similar separate state remaining within the British Empire was one of the alternatives considered by Americans before they settled on independence. In England, there was the considerable body of dissenters, or Protestants not accepting the Church of England, who had enjoyed religious toleration since 1689, but continued to labor until 1828 under various forms of political exclusion. They overlapped with two other amorphous groups, a small number of Commonwealthmen and a larger number of parliamentary reformers. The Commonwealthmen, increasingly eccentric and largely ignored, looked back nostalgically to the Puritan Revolution and the Republican era of Oliver Cromwell. They kept alive memories of the levelers and ideals of equality, well mixed with a pseudo-history of a simple Anglo-Saxon England that had been crushed by the despotism of the Norman conquest. They had less influence in England than in the American colonies, and especially New England, whose origins were closely connected to the Puritan Revolution. The parliamentary reformers were a more diverse and influential group. They were condemned in the 18th century to repeated frustration. Not until the first Reform Bill of 1832 did they begin to accomplish their goals. English discontent. The very power of Parliament meant that political leaders had to take strong measures to assure its votes, measures that were generally 355 denounced by their critics as corruption. Control of Parliament, and especially of the House of Commons, was sustained by various devices, such as patronage or the giving of government jobs called places, or awarding contracts or having infrequent general elections every 7 years after 1716, or the fact that in many constituencies there were no real elections at all. The distribution of seats in the Commons bore no relation to numbers of inhabitants. A town having the right to send members to Parliament was called a borough, but no new borough was created after 1688, or until 1832. Thus, localities that had been 651 important in the medieval or Tudor periods were represented, but towns that had grown up recently, such as Manchester and Birmingham, were not. A few boroughs were populous and democratic, but many had few inhabitants or none, so that influential boroughmongers decided who should represent them in Parliament. Parliamentary politics. The reform movement began in England before the American Revolution, with which it was closely associated. The first agitation for reform centered about John Wilkes, a journalist and member of Parliament who vehemently attacked the policies of King George III. He was vindicated when the courts pronounced the arrest of his publisher illegal, but the king's supporters expelled him from the House of Commons. Wilkes became a political hero, however, and was later re-elected 3 times to the House, which refused to seat him. A whirl of protests, public meetings, and petitions supported him against the exclusionary actions of Parliament. His followers in 1769 founded the Supporters of the Bill of Rights, the first of many societies dedicated to parliamentary reform. His case raised the question of whether the House of Commons should be dependent on the electorate and on the propriety of public agitation out of doors on political questions. It was in this connection, also, that debates in Parliament for the first time came to be reported in the London press. Parliament stood on the eve of a long transition, by which it was to be converted from a select body meeting in private to a modern representative institution answerable to the public and its constituents. Wilkes himself finally regained his parliamentary seat in 1774 and soon introduced the first of many reform bills, none of which passed for over half a century. Agitation for political reform, 652 meanwhile, the important Whig leaders, who had previously managed Parliament by manipulating elections in lightly populated boroughs, began to sense corruption in such methods after control passed to George III and his friends. Their most eloquent spokesman was Edmund Burke, 1729 to 1797, who would become an influential founder of philosophical conservatism. Other reformers called for more frequent elections, annual parliaments, a wider and more equal or even universal male suffrage, with dissolution of some boroughs in which no one was really represented. Burke favored none of these things. In fact, he came strenuously to oppose them. He was more concerned that the House of Commons should be independent and responsible than that it should be mathematically representative. He thought that the landowning interests should govern. But he supported parliamentary reform by pleading for a strong sense of party in opposition to royal encroachments, and he argued that members of Parliament should follow their own best judgment of the country's interests, bound neither by the king on the one hand, nor by their own constituents on the other. Like other reformers, he objected to placemen, or job holders dependent on their ministerial patrons, and he objected to the use made, for political purposes, of a bewildering array of pensions, sinecures, honorific appointments, and ornamental offices, ranks, and titles. In his economical reform of 1782, which curtailed crown patronage, he got many of these abolished. 356, Edmund Burke, 653, Frances Susanna, Lady de Dunstanville by Thomas Gainsborough, English 1727 to 1788. High social status is evident in this portrayal of a young English woman who was the wife of a wealthy member of Parliament. The wealth and status of her social class are apparent in her jewelry, her elegant gown, and her feather. Her hands in the background trees suggest a life of leisure and rural virtues. This is the way that English aristocrats of the 18th century like to imagine themselves and to be portrayed for posterity. Source: National Gallery of Art. The reform movement evolved and took on new strength at the time of the French Revolution, spreading then to more popular levels as members of the skilled artisan class responded to events in France by demanding a more adequate representation of the people in England. They then had upper-class support from Charles James Fox and a minority of the Whigs. But conservatism, as described in Burke's Critiques of the French Revolution, satisfaction with the British Constitution, and a new patriotism that arose during the wars against revolutionary France all raised an impassable barrier. Reform was delayed for another generation. 654. After the American Revolution, which was a kind of political civil war within the English-speaking world, the English reformers generally blamed the trouble with America on King George III. This was less than fair, because Parliament on the American question was never dragooned by the king. The most ardent reformers later argued that if Parliament had been truly representative of the British people, the Americans would not have been driven to independence. This seems unlikely. In any case, reformers of various kinds, from Wilkes to Burke, were sympathetic to the complaints of the American colonials after 1763. There was much political correspondence across the Atlantic. Wilkes was a hero in Boston as well as London. Burke pleaded for conciliation with the colonies in a famous speech of 1775. His very insistence on the powers and dignity of Parliament, however, made it hard for him to find a workable solution. And after the colonies became independent, he showed no interest in the political ideas of the new American states. It was the more radical reformers in England, as in Scotland and Ireland, who most consistently favored the Americans, both before and after independence. They, of course, had no power. On the American 357 side, for a decade before independence, the increasingly discontented colonials, reading English books and pamphlets and reports of speeches, heard George III denounced for despotism and Parliament accused of incorrigible corruption. All this seemed to confirm what Americans had long been reading in the works of English dissenters, or old Commonwealth men, now on the fringes of English society, but sure of a receptive audience in the American colonies. The result was to make Americans suspicious of all actions by the British government, to sense tyranny everywhere, to magnify such things as the Stamp Act into a kind of plot against American liberties. Reformers' influence in American colonies, 655, Edmund Burke's insistence on the political and social value of inherited traditions made him a key figure in the emergence of modern conservatism. Although he favored an independent parliament in Britain, he wrote a famous critique of the Revolution that abolished traditional royal prerogatives in France. He appears here in an engraving from the 1770s, after a painting by Sir Joshua Reynolds, Holton Arcady Images. The real drift in England in the 18th century, however, despite the chronic criticism of Parliament, was for Parliament to extend its powers in a general centralization of the empire. The British government faced somewhat the same problems as centralizing governments on the continent. All had to deal with the issues raised by the Great War of the mid-century, in its two phases of the Austrian Succession and 7 Years' War. Governments everywhere responded to the financial and military costs of these wars by trying to increase their own central power. We have seen how the French government, in attempting to tap new sources of revenue, tried to encroach on the liberties of Brittany and other provinces, and to subordinate the bodies that in France were called parlements. We have likewise seen how the Habsburg government, also in an effort to raise more taxes, repressed local self-government in the empire and consolidated power in a more centralized bureaucracy. The same tendency showed itself in the British system. The Habsburg revocation of 656A constitutional charter in Bohemia in 1749 had its parallel in the revocation of the Charter of Massachusetts in 1774. The disputes of the French king with the estates of Brittany or Languedoc had their parallel in the disputes of the British Parliament with the provincial assemblies of Virginia or New York. And the French government's unsuccessful attempts to collect more taxes from recalcitrant provincial nobles resembled the stymied British attempts to collect more revenue from their colonial subjects in North America. 358 British centralization. Scotland, Ireland, India. The British also faced problems nearer home. Scotland proved a source of weakness in the War of the Austrian Succession. The Lowlanders were loyal enough, But the Highlanders revolted with French assistance in the Jacobite Rising of 1745 and threatened the British government as it was locked in the struggle with France. The Highlands had never really been under any government, even under the old Scottish monarchy before the Union of 1707 with England. Men in the Highlands looked to the heads of their clans to tell them whom and when to fight. A few leaders could throw the whole region to the Stuarts or the French. The British government, after 1745, proceeded to make its sovereignty effective in the Highlands. Troops were quartered there for years. Roads were pushed across the moors and through the glens. Law courts enforced the law of the Scottish lowlands. Revenue officers collected funds for the treasury of Great Britain. The heads of the Scottish clans lost their old quasi-feudal jurisdiction. Fighting Highlanders were incorporated into newly formed Highland regiments of the British Army, under the usual discipline imposed by the modern state on its fighting forces. For 30 years, the Scots were forbidden to wear the kilt or play the bagpipes. British rule in Scotland, 657. In Ireland, the process of centralization worked itself out more slowly. Ireland had been subjected to new repression after the English Revolution of 1688, in part because of Irish involvement with the anti-revolutionary forces. A French army had landed in Ireland, supported the deposed James II, and lost the decisive Battle of the Boyne in 1690. The new English constitutional arrangements, the Hanoverian succession, the Protestant ascendancy, the church and the land settlement in Ireland, together with the prosperity of British commerce, were thus all secured by the continuing subordination of the smaller island. The native or Catholic Irish remained generally pro-French. The Presbyterian Irish disliked both the French and popery, but they were alienated from England also. Many, in fact, emigrated to America in the generation before the American Revolution. Ireland remained quiet in the mid-century wars. When the trouble began between the British Parliament and the American colonies, the Presbyterian Irish generally took the American side. They were greatly stirred by the example of American independence. Thousands formed themselves into volunteer companies. They wore uniforms, armed, and drilled. They demanded both internal reform of the Irish Parliament, which was even less representative than the British, and greater autonomy for the Irish Parliament as against the central government at Westminster. The British in Ireland, faced with these demands, and fearing a French invasion of Ireland during the War of American Independence, the British government made concessions. It allowed an increase of power to the Irish Parliament at Dublin, but from the English Parliament, Catholics were still excluded. In the next war between France and Great Britain, which began in 1793, many Irish felt a warm sympathy for the French Revolution. Catholics and Presbyterians, at last combining, formed a network of United Irish Societies throughout the whole island. They sought French aid, but the French were never able to land a promised army. Even without French 658 military support, the United Irish rose in 1798 to drive out the English and establish an independent republic. The British, suppressing the rebellion, now turned to centralization. The separate Kingdom of Ireland and the Irish Parliament ceased to exist. The Irish were thereafter represented in the Imperial Parliament at Westminster. These provisions were incorporated in the Act of Union of 1801, creating the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, which Irish nationalists vehemently disliked, but which lasted until 1922. British establishments in India also faced new interventions from the centralizing imperial policies of Parliament. At the close of the 7 Years' War, the various British posts in and around Mumbai, Chennai, and Kolkata, cities long known to the English as Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta, were unconnected with each other and subordinate only to the board of directors of the East India Company in London. Company employees interfered at will in the wars and politics of the Indian states and enriched themselves by such means as they could, which included graft, trickery, intimidation, rapine, and extortion. In 1773, the Ministry of Lord North passed a regulating act, of which the main purpose was to regulate and restrict the often illegal actions of British subjects in India, whom no Indian government could control. The company was left with its trading activities, but its political activities were brought under parliamentary supervision. The act gathered all the British establishments under a single governor general, set up a new Supreme Court with British judges at Kolkata, and required the company to submit its correspondence on political matters for review by the ministers of His Majesty's government. Warren Hastings became the first British Governor General in India. He was so high-handed with some of the Indian princes and made so many enemies among jealous English residents in Bengal that he was denounced at home, impeached, and subjected to a trial that dragged on for 7 years in the House of Lords. He was finally acquitted. After Clive, whose interventions had rapidly expanded British 660 power there during the 1750s, Hastings was the main author of British supremacy in India. Meanwhile, in 1784, an India office was created in the British ministry at home. The Governor-General henceforth ruled the growing British sphere in India almost as an absolute monarch, but only as the agent of the Ministry and Parliament of Great Britain. 360 intervention in India. Thus, the trend in the British world was to centralization. Despite the flutter of royalism under George III, the increasing centralization of all British territories developed under the authority of Parliament. What was happening in empire affairs, as in domestic politics in England, was a continuing application of the principles of 1689. The parliamentary sovereignty established in 1689 was now, after the middle of the 18th century, being applied to regions where it had heretofore had little effect. And it was against the centralizing authority of the British Parliament that the Americans primarily rebelled.